Feliza Bursztyn Welding Madness is the first retrospective of the Colombian sculptor Feliza Bursztyn to be organized outside of the artist's home country. The exhibition presents sculptures and two-dimensional works from each stage of the artist's development, showcasing the depth and breadth of Bursztyn's tragically brief and brilliant career. Feliza Bursztyn Welding Madness is curated by Abigail Winograd and Marta Dziewańska with the support of Camilo Leiva. In 1979, Bursztyn uttered the phrase that encapsulated the strategy that had defined her work for decades. In a patriarchal society, women have no choice but to feign madness. Born Jewish in a Catholic country, the child of Polish immigrants, and a feminist in a country dominated by the conservatism of the church, Bursztyn was an outsider. Married at 19 and divorced with 3 children at the age of 24, Bursztyn rejected the circumscribed nature of women's lives in Colombia and intentionally flouted social mores, embracing the mantle of La Loca, the Mad One, as she was dubbed by the press.
Los soldadores.
Her political views informed the material and the content of her sculpture and drove her to challenge the social and artistic status quo. Bursztyn's art and life were deeply and constantly intertwined. Her parents, Jakov and Chaya Bursztyn, were new arrivals to Colombia in 1933. The couple initially intended to return to Poland, but after learning about Hitler's election to the chancellorship in Germany, they decided to stay. Jakov, who had trained as a rabbi in Warsaw, established himself as a textile manufacturer and became a leader within the city's tiny Jewish community. His success afforded his daughter the opportunity to study art in Bogota and later at the Art Students League in New York, as well as the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, Paris, under the tutelage of Osip Zadkin. Her studio in Bogota, a converted garage next to one of her father's factories, became a meeting point for artists, writers, journalists, musicians, politicians, and critics. It was there that she produced her first Curators, junk sculptures, in 1961. Bronze, the material she was trained to work with in Paris, was unavailable in Colombia, so she turned to junkyard scraps, discarded fragments of machines, tires, cables, bolts, and other metal bits. She would use these materials throughout her career, adding hand-dyed fabrics, motors, light and sound to produce increasingly complex, room-sized installations. Eventually, Bursztyn produced immersive experiential spaces. Her sculptures clung to walls, hung from ceilings, perched on stages, and carried out choreographed dances set to music in dramatically lit rooms. She collaborated with writers, experimental musicians, filmmakers, and theatre directors in works that drew inspiration from sources ranging from the natural environment and popular culture to psychoanalysis. Her works were calculated to disturb, provoke, push the limits, and reject the status quo. Bursztyn began her Curators junk sculptures series in 1961, becoming the first artist in Colombia to use non-art materials. The works drew on her training in Europe under the tutelage of the Russian-born sculptor Osip Zadkin, as well as her Parisian contemporaries, specifically the Nouveau Realistes, to whom Zadkin had introduced her. Bursztyn's Curators were composed of discarded scrap metal, corroded tires, and rusted cables welded into rough, abstract compositions. These works represented a radical challenge to prevailing ideals of beauty and what constituted art in Colombian society. Provocatively, Bursztyn gave the assemblages romantic, feminine, and organic names such as Uniflor, Flower, or Niña Alegre, Happy Girl. These titles drew attention to the coarse, industrial appearance of the sculptures, while mocking traditional notions of gender and the perceived masculinity of art itself. In their use of materials, the Curators mined a contradiction: the perceived permanence of industry and technology versus the reality of their planned obsolescence. Bursztyn's coarse artwork seemed to also lament the resultant environmental impact of industrialization, while simultaneously celebrating the ingenuity of impoverished Colombians who readily integrated the fallout into unofficial economies. At the same time, the selection of materials reflected Bursztyn's own material circumstances. This also marked the beginning of Bursztyn's presentation of her work as an act of solidarity. When asked to define herself as an artist, she remarked that she was a worker and a solderer. In November 1967, Bursztyn began a new series, Las Histéricas, the Hysterical Ones. With this new series, she abandoned junk in favor of flexible sheets of stainless steel. Bursztyn bent them into parabolic and circular configurations and fitted them with motors. Thus, she set her work in motion. The title of this series of raving, cacophonous and ironic sculptures links this body of work to Freudian psychoanalysis and the tendency to associate hysteria primarily with women and their sexuality. They reflect Bursztyn's ironic and critical assessment of contemporary mores as they pertain to sexuality, feminism and modernity. In 1968, Bursztyn collaborated with Luis Ernesto Arocha, her friend and experimental filmmaker, to produce Hoy Feliza, Today Feliza, 1968. The film captures Las Histéricas in action, vibrating and mad, intertwined with images of the artist herself, but also with dozens of still images of Hollywood divas and sex symbols, including Greta Garbo, Bette Davis and Marlon Brando. The 8mm film debuted at an exhibition at the Salon Cultural held in the gallery of the Banco de la República, where it was projected on the facade of the building. Also in 1968, Bursztyn produced Siempre Acostada, Always in Bed, for the landmark exhibition Espacios Ambientales, Environments, organized by Marta Traba for the Museum of Modern Art in Bogota. This was Las Histéricas' first presentation en masse. The artists scattered sculptures throughout the space, making sure that their chaotic noise would invade every corner of the building. The room was intermittently illuminated by spotlights, causing the mobile sculptures to cast dramatic shadows while obscuring the source of the din produced by the sporadically visible works. Siempre Acostada pointed to Bursztyn's growing interest in expanding audience interaction and encouraging viewer participation. Throughout the 1960s, the scale of Bursztyn's work increased exponentially. With the mini maquinas, mini machines, she reversed course and began producing smaller-scale works. This was a series born somewhat of necessity, as Bursztyn began the series in a hospital bed while recovering from a devastating car crash. Made from disassembled typewriters and other small manual machines, these small structures are intricate. The artist intended these intimately sized constructions to be manipulated by the audience, thereby creating yet another connection between spectator and artwork. In their mutability, the works remained unstable and open-ended. This time, the participation was individualized rather than based on public confrontational spectacle. The mini maquinas thus demonstrated Bursztyn's commitment to viewer engagement in the form of open proposals, enabling a critique of the hegemonic models of politics and culture. In 1971, Bursztyn collaborated with Arocha for a second time to produce the short film Asilev. In it, the duo animated the mini maquinas to emphasize their machine-like and zoomorphic qualities. They appear as alien creatures, spaceships or satellites that move through empty space. The film's soundtrack was authored by Bogota-based Beatles-inspired rock band Los Tapos and included a psychedelic folk rock song with lyrics in English about magic, dreams, love, the universe and possibilities. Arocha's film locates Bursztyn's work in relation to hippismo, hippieism, with its rejection of convention, ideas of sexual freedom, renunciation of materialism, experimentation with drugs, embrace of new popular art forms, and utopian belief in the possibility of a better future. Bursztyn began this series, Acero sobre Acero, Steel on Steel, in the 1970s. The sculptures were composed of interlocking circular forms in various configurations and sizes. These works reflect Bursztyn's continued exploration of volume and scale. Some were modestly proportioned, while others occupied vast expanses. The artist frequently hung these pieces in her home, and they appeared in numerous photographs, nestled in bushes, hanging from trees, peeking out of the plants. The juxtaposition of industrial materials with the natural environment reflected the dissonant reality of Colombia. The fecundity and bounty of a lush tropical nation, home to the towering Andes, the riches of the Amazon River basin, and connected to both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, contrasted with a newly industrialized nation eager to embrace a more technological future. Bursztyn probed these polarities throughout her career. In 1972, Bursztyn began her series Camas, the Beds. Bursztyn debuted the first Cama, Construcción en Movimiento, bed construction in motion, at the 3rd Bienal de Artes Coltegere in Medellín, and was awarded first prize for the work at the first Salón Nacional de Artistas de la Universidad Jorge Tadeo Lozano the same year. The exhibition Las Camas took place in 1974 at Museo de Arte Moderna de Bogotá, Mambo. The sculptures consisted of metal bed frames fitted with motors and draped in satin fabric. The colours of the coverings were not insignificant, but rather referenced, as one critic noted, the state, the church and the people. The motors triggered suggestive vibrations, lending the camas a blatantly erotic charge. The sculptures were scattered in a darkened gallery with dim spot lighting. The darkness and intimacy of the gallery space turned visitors into accidental voyeurs, challenging notions public and private space. By turning the gallery into a bedroom, Bursztyn confronted taboos about sex in a heavily Catholic country, as well as the perceived neutrality of museums. Bursztyn frequently collaborated with artists, musicians, theatre directors, and others. The Las Camas exhibition featured a musical score by the experimental electronic musician and composer Jacqueline Nova, whose work, like that of Bursztyn, was famous for being radically innovative and disturbing. Bursztyn's work frequently engaged with aspects of popular culture, including music and cinema. Rosemary's Baby borrows its title from Roman Polanski's eponymous film, released in Colombia in 1969. Based on Ira Levin's novel, the plot of Rosemary's Baby is centered on the pregnancy of Rosemary Woodhouse and her growing suspicion that her elderly neighbors are members of a satanic cult. Thematically, Rosemary's Baby echoed the concerns of Bursztyn's own oeuvre: paranoia, psychoanalysis, gender dynamics, women's liberation, and Christianity. Bursztyn's Rosemary's Baby 1973 is composed of a crib, steel scrap, black satin sheets, and a motor. It is the only work in the Camas series to use a crib rather than a bed. The steel frame, originally painted black, was later painted white and the sides removed. Given Bursztyn's predilection for Freudian analysis, it is worth noting the resonance this work must have had for the artist, who by this time was separated from her daughters following the dissolution of her abusive first marriage. Her ex-husband left Bogotá for Texas with their children after the divorce. This separation deeply affected Bursztyn. Rosemary's Baby is a bitter reflection of the limits and expectations placed on women, as well as a critique of the normalized brutality deeply rooted in an aggressively patriarchal cultures. In 1981, Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote, "Feliza has never done something more subversive than turning car accidents into artworks." Indeed, in 1968, Bursztyn had been involved in a dramatic accident, driving to the opening of an exhibition with her artist friend Beatriz Daza. The accident left Daza dead and Bursztyn grievously injured, her face shattered, her chest almost crushed and requiring reconstructive surgery. Bursztyn never talked publicly about the accident that took her friend and changed her appearance, leaving her body as the sole mute witness of the event. In addition to their autobiographical content, Bursztyn's colourful assemblages can be read as allusions to proletarian and male labour. As the gallery owner Alonso Garces would reflect years later, Feliza faced an even greater difficulty due to her being a woman in a society in which art made by women was related more to painting on porcelain than to soldering with acetylene torch. Indeed, her adoption of welding as an artistic technique challenged the undervaluing and invisibility of blue-collar and female labour. Bursztyn's colour series also complicated the ideas developed by the Nouveau Realistes and contemporaneous artists working under the pop art rubric. Pop art in Colombia is distinct from its meaning in more industrialized countries, And while her use of car scraps can refer to economic development and to a growing consumer culture, it also simultaneously points to scarcity and underdevelopment. When Bursztyn fled Bogota in 1981, she closed the door on her studio and her work. The sculptures and all archival materials she left behind remain to this day. Bursztyn's widower, Pablo Leiva, collected and catalogued the other materials left behind after her death. Bursztyn herself did not think much about preserving material for posterity. Welding Madness offers a glimpse of the archive, including letters, photographs, sketches, exhibition catalogues, newspapers and magazine articles, with many being shown for the first time. Over the course of her career, Bursztyn received public and private commissions resulting in the installation of sculptures around the country. The first to be erected was Homenaje a Gandhi, Homage to Gandhi, in 1971. The sculpture, composed of a bulldozer chassis, still towers above the traffic on Carrera 7A at Calle 100 in Bogota. In 1973, Bursztyn was commissioned to do the interior design of the offices of Par Publicidad in Medellin. She debuted an untitled sculpture, later dubbed Medusa, a massive tangle of disassembled metal pipes suspended from a crane for La Fiera Industrial de Bogota in 1975. The following year, La Última Cena, consisting of wall panels made from compressed aluminium cutlery, was installed in Bogota in a complex operated by the Servicio Nacional de Aprendizaje, or SENA, the entity of charge of vocational training in all of Colombia. Andromeda, a massive hanging sculpture, would be installed at another SENA building in 1977. As early as 1967, Bursztyn was awarded the commission to create a monument honoring President Alfonso López Pomajero on the campus of the Universidad Nacional. However, the proposal submitted by the artist raised controversy and was ultimately rejected for failing to resemble the ex-president. The sculpture was posthumously erected in 2009. La Baila Mecánica premiered on the 5th of April 1979 at the Galeria Garcés Velasquez in Bogota. It was the ultimate expression of Bursztyn's ongoing experiments with material, light, sound and movement. Although only 5 elements were ultimately exhibited, the ballet initially consisted of 7 large, upright and mysterious figures dressed in shrouds that the artist humanized and individualized by giving each a name. They dance, alone or in each other's company, with their own distinct movements, to music written by the 12th century composer Welding Madness. Describing the work, Bursztyn said, "I am convinced that each sculpture has its own character, its own personality, its own movement, a distinct tone, a world of its own, exactly like people. So naturally they each have a name: the Fragata, Piolín, Pipa, Gordillo, Pechuga, Chiquito, and Bailón. Hooded blind men who all dance one by one, 2 or 3 at a time, spasmodic and trembling, around an orange dwarf who never rests." This cast of 5 danced upon a heavily spotlit stage, facing a row of chairs at scheduled times throughout the day. Even the exhibition brochure reflected the theatricality of the work, by mimicking a program for a ballet or play by listing Bursztyn as director, naming the 7 cast members and acknowledging the crew of technical experts who assisted with the electrical systems, lighting and installation. There is something anti-monumental and deeply troubling about these motorized, unstable and precarious veiled figures. The visible electrical cords tethering each piece to the ceiling, which Bursztyn left intentionally visible, add an ominous quality. La Baila Mecánica likely referenced the increased violence within Colombian society and the growing tensions over the violent and repressive government response. Elected in 1978, President Julio César Turbay Ayala instituted a law known as the Security Statute. The law allowed the military to arrest, detain, interrogate and torture those suspected of ties to Marxist guerrilla groups without warrant or cause. When viewed through this lens, La Baila Mecánica is a tragic foreshadowing of the artist's own future. Bursztyn regularly exhibited her work in Cuba. Her embrace of the Cuban Revolution drew the suspicion of the authorities in conservative US-allied Colombia. She was arrested in her home in the early morning of the 24th of July and detained and tortured for 48 hours. On the 5th of August 1981, Pablo Leiva, Bursztyn's second husband, drove to the Mexican embassy while she lay on the floor in the car's back seat. The couple had contacted Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a close friend and a world-famous author, who arranged for Bursztyn to take refuge in the Mexican embassy. After several months in Mexico City, Bursztyn and Leiva decided to opt for exile in Paris. Bursztyn hoped to create a new life for herself in a city she knew and loved. Tragically, this was not to be. On the evening of the 8th of January 1982, at dinner, Bursztyn suffered a heart attack and died in the restaurant surrounded by her husband Pablo Leiva, Garcia Marquez and several friends. She was 49 years old.
Bardzo smutno i przedwcześnie kończy się historia życia i twórczości Felizy Bursztyn. I właśnie dlatego, żeby kolejne pokolenia miały okazję poznać jej twórczość, zobaczyć, jak wyprzedzała czas swoją sztuką. Myślę, że tego typu wystawy są znakomitą okazją do tego, żeby spotkać artystkę poprzez jej pracę. I zachęcam wszystkich do tego, żeby odwiedzali to muzeum, ponieważ jego misją, celem jest promowanie właśnie takich artystek, które przez historię w jakiś sposób zostały pominięte, zapomniane z różnych powodów.